So my name's Rayna Ripple, and I've been working on some different projects for the Halt the Harm Network. Happy to be here with Christina from the Environmental Health News online and environmental news source, which has been a fantastic resource over the years, especially on fracking and just a variety of environmental health issues. Christina is going to go ahead and give a quick intro, but for those who don't know, the Environmental Health News source is just a fantastic place to go to look at the science, to look at some of the health issues that are really facing us in the country, especially on these oil and gas issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina and have her walk you through this.
Thank you so much, Rayna, and thank you everybody for coming today. So I recently wrote a series on fracking and health, and I also wrote a series that just published last week on the mental health impacts of pollution and climate change. So today I'll talk about both some of the psychological stressors that are associated with air pollution and fracking. And I'll also talk about some of the physical changes that air pollution exposure causes in the brain that can impact mental health. But first, I will tell you a little bit more about myself. I've been the Pittsburgh reporter for Environmental Health News since 2018, where I cover environmental health and justice with a focus on Western Pennsylvania. And before that, I freelanced kind of all over the place. I wrote for a bunch of outlets, sometimes about environmental health and justice, sometimes about LGBTQ issues and gender equality. And I'm also the co-founder of the Pittsburgh chapter of the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. And I'm currently working on a book. The working title is The New War on Cancer, and it's about initiatives aimed at reducing toxic exposures that contribute to cancer risk. It'll be published by Island Press sometime in 2023. I also wanted to tell you just a little bit more about Environmental Health News in case it's new to you. We're a national nonprofit news website founded by a scientist named Pete Myers in 2002. He was the co-author of a book called Our Stolen Future, which was one of the first books to dive into the dangers of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Our mission is to increase scientific literacy around environmental health to drive impact. And we do that through original reporting like I do. And we also have lots of newsletters that a team of researchers curate on various topics related to environmental health that are really great. So if you're interested in this stuff, we have a bunch of newsletters you could sign up for on the website. So last week I published a 5-part series in collaboration with the Allegheny Front, which is another Western Pennsylvania news outlet focused on the environment. Part 1 was about the mental health impacts of air pollution. Part 2 is about the mental health impacts of water contamination and specifically lead exposure. Part 3 is about the mental health impacts of climate change. And part 4 is about how therapists are learning to treat climate anxiety. And then there's a 5th part that is about solutions and ways to take action that also includes lots of mental health resources. So you can read that full series on the EHN website at ehn.org/mental health. So it's probably not surprising to anyone here with an interest and concerns about fracking that living near pollution can be stressful in ways that contribute to depression or anxiety. I spoke with Melanie Mead, who is a clean air activist in Clairton, Pennsylvania, which has some of the worst air quality in the country, who told me about her experiences for that recent series I published. And I also heard from Natisha Washington, who's a clean water advocate who works in Southwest Pennsylvania communities. And I wanted to just let them speak for themselves. Can you see the video? Maybe thumbs up, okay.
Unfortunately, the sound doesn't seem to be coming through.
On you from an hour
There we
to
go.
hour basis versus, you know, looking at the yellow or orange or red days on the news. It's a very different experience. It's very direct and in your face. And there aren't enough people around to have the talk with that you're possibly scared or afraid. The air pollution doesn't have to exist. And we know that we cannot control mental health, but I'm sure that air pollution in some way affects mental health. Having to address both for any community is very difficult because people are torn, and that makes us break into different groups and isolates us from looking at the issue as being connected, and that's what's harmful. So a lot of people hear about these health hazards and they're like, yeah, just stay at home, you know, get your filters, you know, you'll be okay. But one thing that we try to tell people is this is a all day life impact. So from when you go to sleep to when you wake up to when you go to your office in whatever area you are to when you go back, these environmental impacts are always coming at you. You can't escape air, you can't escape water, you can't escape the land that you're around. And people who are burdened by that on a daily basis, not only are they bogged down mentally, they're bogged down physically, and people don't think about how that physical impact can bog down their mental. Because if you don't have the energy to deal with yourself mentally, then you're going to just sit down and you're going to be like, oh, I don't like any of this that's going on. I don't have the energy to do anything about it. And then when you finally do get the energy and you finally do get that support system, as people talk about in therapy and self-care, these support systems, these resources that you have come to you, then you feel a lot better.
So I mentioned that I also previously, back in March, published a multi-part series on the impacts of on the health impacts of fracking. And one of the stories in that series specifically focuses on mental health. You can read that full series at ehn.org/fractured. In part 2 of that series, I looked at the mental health impacts of fracking. And again, these are all focused on psychological effects, the kind of stressors associated with living near fracking wells. And I got to know a Washington County family who experienced some of those impacts firsthand. Washington County is the most heavily fracked county in Pennsylvania in the Marcellus Shale region. This is Lexi in the photo. She's 16 years old in this photo, but she got sick when she was about 8 years old after a fracking well was drilled about a half a mile from her elementary school. And eventually she was diagnosed with a benzene sensitivity. And when her family first spoke out about their concerns, there was a lot of backlash because a lot of people in their community had sold or leased their mineral rights and were benefiting financially from the industry's presence there. So Lexi had experiences as an 8-year-old where she went over to a friend's house to play, and the whole time she was there, the parents just said, you know, you're really making all this up for attention, aren't you? You're not really sick. They had experiences where they went to like town or community meetings and tried to share their experience and express their concerns that Lexi's illness was being caused by exposures related to the fracking wells, and they were shouted at and screamed at in these public forums. Eventually they moved away to get away from the school district and have a fresh start in a school district that didn't have fracking wells nearby. But as part of my reporting in 2019, I tested their air and their water and their urine samples and found that they were still being exposed to high levels of some of the chemicals used in fracking. They still lived within a half a mile of a handful of fracking wells because they stayed in Washington County. And one of the chemicals I found in their samples was benzene. So they were still having some benzene exposure. Lexi struggles with anxiety and depression, which she says started when they were feeling kind of ostracized and alienated within their community. And she just had this heartbreaking quote she told me, where she said, "It's not fair. I just want to be normal and have a normal life like other kids." There have also been, so that's one specific family's story, but there have also been numerous research studies that have found a link between fracking and mental illness. So a 2017 literature review looked at all the available studies on the mental health impacts of fracking and found it's common for people in fracked communities to experience worry, anxiety, and depression about lifestyle, health, safety, and financial security, and that entire communities can experience collective trauma as a result of the boom-bust cycle that often occurs when industries impinge on community life. A handful of other studies have made similar findings. That was a big literature review that looked at a bunch of studies, but a 2018 study found that stress and depression are higher among Pennsylvanians who live near fracking wells. A 2020 study in Denton, Texas, found increased stress and animosity and tension between community members as a result of fracking, for some of those reasons that I described that Lexis family experienced, where some people are very concerned about the health and environmental impacts, and other people are excited about the economic benefits brought by the industry. And a 2020 study that surveyed Colorado households found that uncertainty about environmental health risks of fracking and feelings of political powerlessness led to chronic stress and depression in people who lived near fracking wells. I also looked at a 2017 study by the Southwestern Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project, where Rayna Ripple used to work, and they found that the most common symptoms among Pennsylvanians who live near fracking wells were difficulty sleeping, anxiety, worry, and depressed mood. And Hannah Blinn, who was the lead author of that study, told me that one community member said that after fracking moved in, they now understood why sleep deprivation was used as a torture technique. And she pointed out that that kind of stress creates its own health impacts. So, it becomes difficult to sort out if someone has a headache, is that because of a chemical exposure they're getting from fracking wells, or because they haven't slept and their neighbors don't trust them anymore and they're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. But in writing this more recent series that I published last week, I was surprised to learn that air pollution exposure also causes some physical changes to our brain, in addition to those kind of social and psychological stressors that can impact our mental health. So I talked to the lead authors of 3 recent studies linking air pollution to mental illness, which I'll tell you a bit about now. So the first study was just published this last April, and it was really unique because it followed kids who had been exposed to air pollution for 20 years. So it was a really long study. It was a relatively small group of kids, about 2,000 kids in the United Kingdom. And it found that the more air pollution people were exposed to as children, the more likely they were to experience mental illness when they turn 18. And age 18 is when symptoms of mental illness frequently first appear, that kind of transition to adulthood. That's can be a difficult time, is when symptoms of mental illness often initially crop up. The study was also unique because it looked at symptoms rather than diagnoses to get a more complete picture of people's mental health. So instead of saying, do you have a diagnosis from a clinician that you have depression or bipolar disorder, they used surveys that asked about things like dependence on substance, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, delusions, hallucinations, eating disorders. And those were rated on a scale which gave them a much more complete picture of someone's kind of overall mental health. This study only looked at PM 2.5 and nitrogen oxide pollution, and it only saw the association with nitrogen oxide pollution. And I did a double check, and a number of studies have found that fracking communities also often have higher levels of nitrogen oxides in the air as a result of the industry's presence. And Aaron Rubin, who was the lead author of that study, told me, they only saw the strong association in the study with nitrogen oxide, but he said the more we study additional air pollutants, the less confident I am that there's any class that doesn't harm the brain. So that study was pretty groundbreaking for the reasons I mentioned, but it was also quite small. So I also talked to the lead author of a huge study that looked at mental health data from 151 million people in the United States and 1.4 million people in Denmark, and found that long periods of increased air pollution in urban areas were linked to a 16% increase in cases of bipolar disorder and a 6% increase in depression diagnoses. And the researcher pointed out to me when we spoke that they had more detailed data available for the Denmark group. And among that group, which again was still quite big, it was 1.4 million people, the link was even stronger. So air pollution exposure in the Denmark group was linked to a 31% increase in bipolar disorder, a 104% increase in schizophrenia, a 210% increase in personality disorder, and a 68% increase in major depression. They looked at 87 different air pollutants, and they also controlled for other factors that could impact mental health. So things like a family history of mental illness, poverty, and community violence, which is also something that that first study did. And the researcher I spoke to about this study said that he was personally really surprised by how strong the signal was, that there was a link between long periods of high levels of air pollution and mental illness. So both of those two studies, those two first studies, looked at the long-term impacts of air pollution exposure on mental health. So I also talked to the lead author of a 2019 study that was the first to ever look at short-term mental health impacts of air pollution exposure in children. He looked at records for the only emergency room in Cincinnati. So he effectively was able to capture the whole city and found that every increase in PM 2.5 exposure of 10 micrograms per cubic meter was linked to a substantial jump in emergency room visits for children's mental health issues within the next 3 days. And one thing that's really interesting about that is that all of those daily exposures that they saw during the time period of the study remained below EPA legal thresholds for daily pollution levels. So this is part of a growing body of research that suggests that air pollution is harmful, even at levels well below current legal limits. And the lead author pointed out that their study is likely the tip of the iceberg because it only captured kids who had problems so severe that they went to the emergency room. It didn't consider how spikes in air pollution might be impacting people with milder anxiety or depression that wasn't bad enough to prompt an emergency room visit. And in this chart on the right, as part of my reporting, I looked at how often just one air monitor in Allegheny County near Pittsburgh had exceeded the median level of air pollution in that study that was found to send extra kids to the emergency room with mental illness. And for last year, and as you can see, it happened quite often. So these kind of spikes in air pollution that are high enough to, prompt extra emergency room visits for mental illness in kids are pretty common in some urban areas and potentially also in fracking communities. So scientists are still working to figure out exactly what happens in our brains that impacts our mental health when our brains are exposed to air pollution. But a lot of scientists think that it's related to inflammation. So chronic inflammation in the brain can damage neurons that are involved in the brain and nervous system's regulatory responses, which can in turn impact mental health. And in animal studies, persistent inflammation of the brain creates symptoms that mimic things like bipolar disease and depression. It's also worth mentioning that in general, the effects in individual people in these studies was pretty moderate, but the implications for communities as a whole are huge because they suggest that, if we cut air pollution exposure, we could go a long way toward improving a community's overall mental health and healthcare costs. My collaborator on that series, Julie Grant at the Allegheny Front, created 2 radio stories about climate change and mental health as part of our series on pollution's mental toll. She found that feelings of anxiety, grief, and longing for what's been lost in the environment and worry about what will happen in the future with climate change are becoming more pervasive. That there are resources available and therapists who are specifically trained to address climate anxiety, and that connecting with others who care about this issue and taking action are the key to maintaining your mental health while also working on climate change issues. I thought I would show you another short video. This was Julie's.
I learn something new about the climate crisis. I feel shocked. I can't believe that this is our future, that we're coming to something like this. I can't believe that something like that we live on could be at risk this much. So yeah, it does make me sad. It does make me angry, but it also makes me ready to perform action and be engaged with the community and make a difference. I mean, I feel my best self after I talk to people about climate change, after I talk to people about things that I'm passionate about. I am a member of the Three Rivers Birding Club, the Western Pennsylvania Mushroom Club, obviously Pittsburgh Youth for Climate Action, PICA. And when I'm with a community talking about something that is such a pressing issue and so something that that's so close to my heart, it makes me feel a lot better about it. And it makes me have hope for our future.
When you see all these awful things happening in the world with climate change, it's like a lot sometimes. And it's like sometimes you feel like all that weight is on your shoulders and it's your job to fix it. And sometimes you feel helpless because, I mean, recycling is good, saving energy is good, saving water is good, all those things are good, but those aren't the things that are really contributing to climate change. It's like the big companies, capitalism, that's really making an impact on the climate. And the main thing that our Pittsburgh Youth Climate Action and other organizations of kids can do is like educate, bring awareness, start conversations about it. Because I mean, we can't shut down pipelines and major oil companies. Like that's not really in our control right now. But what we can do is make sure that other kids our age and younger know about it, know what they can do to fight for it and make a difference.
So I mentioned that taking action, again and again, the therapists that Julie spoke with mentioned that taking action is one way to help alleviate some of those psychological stressors that are associated with climate change. And that's true for worries and stress about pollution too. So as part of that mental health series, we have a solutions and resources page that includes a directory, a link to a directory of therapists who are trained in treating climate anxiety and community support groups, and lists of local and national organizations that are working to address climate change, air pollution, and water contamination. And there's also an immediate opportunity for climate action that we wanted to talk about today. The EPA is seeking public comments on its proposal to strengthen methane regulations for the oil and gas industry. So I am going to turn it over to Rayna to tell you a little bit more about that.
And thank you so much, Christina. This has been an amazing presentation. And after I go through this quickly, we will open this up for Q&A. But I just want to, again, reiterate what Christina and what so many therapists and mental health professionals have said to us, and I know this is true for my own life. Really taking action helps to defray and eliminate, or at least minimize that feeling of helplessness that I think so many of us have experienced and maybe are experiencing. I'm happy to say that I was actually on the Pedaltopia bike ride with Malcolm and others, and that felt really good. But there is something very pertinent, and again, something I know Ava said, we have to address this, and we have to address this in a major national as well as international way. And this is where this proposed EPA methane rule and the comment period, which is open right now, I think is so, so important. So I just put up a couple points here to draw people's attention to why that is so important. And one of the things I think that everybody needs to realize, and I'm hoping that this message gets out, is that as we reduce methane pollution, a lot of the things that people are experiencing, the frontline communities, the things we're seeing here in Washington County where I live, will be reduced, because you reduce methane, you capture methane, and you also at the same time address some of those co-pollutants. So it's going to create health for our climate, but it's also going to create a lot of health and healthier situations for frontline communities. And so that's a very important point that I wanted to draw out from this methane rule. And what we're trying to do with this comment period, and I'm involved with a federal group that Halt the Harm Network has been working really hard on trying to promote comments, is to basically say to the EPA, here are some ways you can strengthen your current proposed rule. And those ways are outlined here. And one thing I want to note from the bullet point before is that this is really the first time that the EPA has addressed existing oil and gas. So I think there's a good sense of how things can be strengthened at the federal level. And some of that is based on some action some of the states have taken. So Colorado and New Mexico, for instance, ending routine flaring. So really saying you cannot flare unless it's an emergency situation. You need to just take that out of the infrastructure equation and capture the methane. And that's an economic benefit for them, which they should certainly be taking advantage of. But then I think one of the really amazing things, and from a community-based participatory research perspective, which is a lot of the work that I did when I was at the Environmental Health Project, we really do see an opportunity for the community monitoring and for community members to say, listen, something's going on. And that is one of the things that the EPA is really bringing out in this methane rule, which is to say they could help and really take advantage of a community monitoring system to be more responsive to leaks and to really listen to the community. And that's something I think that really could be brought out again in public comments. And then the last way to strengthen this is to really say that there's some wells out there which do not have a huge output of methane, but they tend to leak disproportionately. So the EPA methane rule right now says those wells would be monitored perhaps only once in their lifetime. And so one of the key things that we're asking for to strengthen that is to say these wells, all wells, need to be regularly monitored. We also are putting up a discussion board in the Halt the Harm space. And maybe Ryan, you can drop the link for that into the chat. But as I'm saying in this last bullet point, this is really a precursor to the idea that there's going to be supplemental rules introduced next year. And so what they're really trying to do is capture comments in this current comment period, which is again open through January 14th, so that they can make these supplemental rules that much stronger. I do anticipate that there's going to be some industry pushback. So I think it's critical that as many community members, and especially people from frontline communities, share their stories, provide their written comments, and really make a point of saying, we want this rule, we want it to be as strong as possible. And again, taking action makes us all feel better. So I just want to say that again. I think it's just critical that we have to take this action, and it helps. It helps with our mental health. So with that, I don't know if you had any other comments that you wanted to make, Christina, but I think we can open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, happy to open to Q&A. I was just going to say if anyone wants to chat directly after this, I'd be happy to hear from you. My email address is here. The URL again up top for the mental health series that includes all the links to those studies that I talked about in the first story in the series that's about air pollution. And my Twitter handle and Environmental Health News' Twitter handle are there too. Thank you so much, Rayna.
Absolutely. And Ryan, can we open this up for everyone to just directly ask questions, or do I need to read these from the chat?
Yeah, definitely. Folks are welcome to unmute yourself. And if there's a lot of chatter, then we can do some hand raising to keep everything organized. And feel free to use the chat as well. So I did just put a link in the chat. It's a special link that'll bring you to the Health and Harm Network. We have actually a new platform. So you'll be one of the first people joining the brand new platform with that link. And it's also where the replay will be posted. So I mentioned that it's new in case you're saying, I already have an account. You'll be invited to create a new account in the new platform.
So we do have one question in the chat right now. This is from Jenny, and she had asked, and Jenny, feel free to jump in and ask this yourself, but just that they are considering creating a well watchers initiative in Marietta where there's a high number of injection wells, and she's just wondering if there's any advice.
Rayna, you might actually be more equipped to offer advice on that than I am.
Right, and then I see she's asking a follow-up question, and I hope I don't butcher this word, but she's also asking, what about teratogenic effects? In terms of injection wells, so that's actually something I will say I've been working with a group down in Texas, and I know there's a bunch of different groups, and especially over in Ohio, which I think, Jenny, is where you are. Injection wells is definitely a really different animal, especially when it comes to methane. That is not as much the problem, but it's all connected. It's all really the same beast of the industry. And I think that the more the EPA and the more these groups, the community groups, are doing monitoring, I've seen some really great results coming out of that. Ryan can talk about this, and I don't know if anybody else is on here from livable Arlington down in Texas, but I think that having that community presence and having that really strong community oversight, really being a watchdog, is starting to make a huge difference in terms of how the industry behaves and how easily they're able to pollute our specific communities. Did you want to add anything, Christina, on the teratogenic effects?
Yeah, so I did have to Google that really quickly to make sure I knew what teratogenic effects are. There's a pretty big body of scientific literature on the associations between fracking and preterm births, and a sort of smaller body of literature on living near fracking and birth defects or adverse birth outcomes. And of all the kind of health effects that have been linked to living near fracking in epidemiological studies, studies on adverse birth outcomes and preterm births are kind of I think there's the largest number of them, and they have some of the strongest and most compelling evidence. So I didn't get into that as part of this series that specifically focused on mental health impacts associated with air pollution, but I have written about a number of those studies that looked at the effects on birth outcomes in the past.
There was a question, and not a follow-up question, but this is a little bit more related, I think, to the methane rule. So I think I can take this from Ruth, who asked, is the EPA actually amenable to tightening regulations? And the answer is yes, they actually are, I think, working really closely with a number of groups at the national level. And they're also reaching out to Indigenous communities. So I think that this is a very, very clear message they're sending to us, which is they want to tackle methane pollution. They're definitely going to address it in existing oil and gas infrastructure, and they want these regulations to be as strong as they possibly can. So I think the more we put our comments in, the more we're really going to get out of this process. So yes, the EPA is showing every sign that they really do want to tighten these regulations and make them effective. And then there's another question here from Cheryl, living in northern Colorado. She said there's 53,000 fracking wells just north of us. Even after regulations against flaring, companies continued to flare. They were not successful in pushing for monitoring. What can be done to enforce regulations where it is a major economical driver?
That's a tough question. Rayna could attest that that certainly is an uphill battle. I think, where we've seen advocacy groups in Pennsylvania have some success is through lawsuits. So if you're able to kind of join forces with an organization that has an attorney on staff and the capacity to file a citizen's lawsuit, if it's clear that laws are being violated or regulations aren't being enforced, that's obviously difficult. That's also a difficult thing to do. I don't know, Rayna or Douglas, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, the other thing I would add to this, and again, this sort of follows up on what Ruth had asked, is I think one of the most important things is this willingness on the EPA's part to listen to community monitoring, to listen to what the community is saying. And so I think in a situation like this, where Colorado at the state level is saying one thing, but then you at the local level are seeing something totally different happening, I'm very hopeful, not totally confident, but certainly hopeful that this EPA process will bring us closer to realizing that, yes, something's happening at the local level, at the community level, and that the EPA will start to actually pay attention to the type of methane and flaring and things like this that are happening, regardless of the state regulatory environment.
And then I see Marty has a question here. What about the mental health professionals training on environmental exposures resulting in a mental health crisis? How is this discussed and researched in medical schools? And the short answer is, I don't believe that it is. As far as I know, that's not something that people are specifically getting training in right now. But I think there are a lot of parallels to how therapists are learning to address and talk about climate change and climate anxiety with their patients. And one therapist who my colleague Julie interviewed said something I thought was really insightful, where she said, we have to equip therapists to talk about things like this because it's a totally different beast than people's usual fears. So if someone had a fear of flying, then you probably would work with them and coach them through facing their fear and getting to the point where they could get on an airplane and overcome it. But if they had a fear of fire, you wouldn't encourage them to go into a burning house. So how do we train therapists to know how to talk to people about this threat that is very real, so that they don't make the mistake of trying to minimize people's concerns or tell them they shouldn't be concerned. And I think that's really similar to fears about environmental exposures, right? That therapists and mental health professionals are increasingly learning how to talk to people about threats that are very real, that are facing their families and their communities. And I think that would fall into a similar category.
I just want to make sure we don't miss Anna, because I see you have a hand up, and I know there's a couple other questions in the chat. So Anna?
Hi, I'm out here in California in the LA area in Long Beach, and working with primarily with Sierra Club and other groups to try to stop expanding oil drilling in our local wetlands. And it's caused a lot of split in our community, even among environmentalists, which is stressful too, because people who were allies for years are now taking sides depending on how much they want to compromise with existing and expanding fossil fuel industry, right? So, but thank you very much for this topic. And also I wondered, I know that one young girl said, well, we can't go out and stop pipelines, but of course, we work with tribal people, local tribal people in our area. And that's kind of background that I'm coming from, that engagement with tribal people. And that's exactly what tribal people are doing. You know, whether they are able to or not, that's what they're doing, right? So I was wondering, the people and the way that I worked with people, there's a lot of ceremony involved and a lot of knowledge and wisdom that comes from understanding how to deal with mental health issues. And no disrespect to psychiatry or Western, any kind of that, but also I was just curious as to whether anybody back there or in your research, you're reaching out to try to understand more how people have coped with 500 years of basically, you know, climate destruction, you know, and it's quite powerful, you know, these what I've watched, you know, with our group is that when we have people don't like to say protest anymore, they say protect, right? Water protectors. I say, okay, you protectors can protect us protesters, because I'm very much of a protester, but I notice that what they will have a healing walk, but there or a ceremony that will also involve holding up signs and honking horns and everything. It's really beautiful to see that kind of combination and activism. And of course, now we have up in Canada, the tiny house movement. And I just wondered if you had or researched any of that ability, how that works with helping to sustain people on the front lines, because I think it's valuable. Thank you. Just wondering.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. That's a really good point. I did hear from some of the folks I talked to who are kind of on the front lines, including Melanie Mead, who you saw speak in that video, who said, you know, that in addition to like going to therapy and doing self-care, that kind of like that spiritual leaders or spiritual gurus and those kinds of like the healing walk, those kinds of initiatives have been really meaningful for them. So I certainly think there's a place for those types of things. And there are also a number of, you know, in addition to sort of traditional Western psychology that Julie talked about in the climate piece, she also looked at a number of sort of mutual support organizations that are just community-based groups where there's one that sounded really interesting to me that's structured like Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's a support group for people who are feeling overwhelmed or depressed about the state of the world, where they get together to talk about those feelings, and then also figure out ways to collectively take action and ways to collectively support their mental health around those issues. So I think you're right. I think there are lots of additional venues for seeking out resources.
Yeah, it's kind of like a whole PTSD thing, right? I mean, that too, that approach. Thank you.
I know Christina has to leave us right at 3, so I want to skip ahead just to one question, and then I'll work backwards. But Christina, Denise had a question, and I think you can answer this specifically based on the fracturing series. Please discuss methane pollution. What else is in it? I can address that if you need me to, but also benzene sensitivity. What is the test for this? What can be done if you have high levels? Does it stay in your body?
So benzene leaves the body pretty quickly, like probably within 48 hours. So it's tricky to catch. You would have to have an exposure and then have a blood test or a urine test pretty quickly after your suspected exposure. The way that Lexi, who was diagnosed with a benzene sensitivity, who I interviewed for my series, was diagnosed with a benzene sensitivity, was that she was so sick so frequently while the fracking well was being drilled next to her school that they were referred to a toxicologist who, you know, she was tested numerous times and found to have pretty high levels of benzene in her body, and had such a violent reaction that that was essentially what they deduced had happened. So it wasn't as clear of an answer and a diagnosis as I think most people would want, but the toxicologist said, you know, it looks like this is probably the amount of benzene that everyone in this community is being exposed to by way of these fracking wells being drilled. And then this kid had a particularly strong kind of violent physical reaction to that exposure. You know, so it's not it's not like a blood test. We know you have a benzene sensitivity. It was like you were exposed to benzene and you got really sick, and we think that's what happened.
And I just want to add in one thing in terms of methane pollution, in terms of, you know, you have co-pollutants, and I tried to emphasize this earlier. So anytime you have methane, anytime it's leaking, anytime it's certainly flaring, many times, especially in a leaking situation, there is going to be co-pollutants such as benzene, right? So methane rarely occurs on its own. It's almost always going to be showing up with these co-pollutants. And that's where a lot of the health problems come from. But methane itself also creates some health concerns for people from like ozone. It's an ozone precursor, but I might have that wrong, don't quote me on that, but it does create problems with asthma, and it does create problems with ozone for people in the local area. And of course, it's this climate forcing gas. So overall, and a very rapid climate forcing gas. So if we can control methane, if we can keep it out of the atmosphere, we're going to avoid a lot of the detrimental health impacts that are going to come from unchecked climate change in the short term. So that's something that I think is really important to understand. And then there's another question. Hopefully I'm not missing anything that Christina needs to answer before she goes, but I just want to very quickly say from Carla's question, will the PADEP be the group actually enforcing the EPA methane standard? Yes. So essentially what we're looking at, as I understand it now, is there's going to be federal implementation plans, but then they're called FIPs. So those federal implementation plans will then go to the state for the state to create an SIP, a state implementation plan. And so ultimately, in most cases, the state is going to actually implement the methane rule. And so there's going to be certainly a push for us, especially in some of the states that have been really weak on this, which are most of them, but Pennsylvania and Texas and others, to really say, now we've got a strong federal rule and the state has to meet the strength of that. Just scanning. I want to say thank you, Ben, for speaking out and just direct people to the ATSDR, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry link that he put in there. And also, John, thank you for FACT, Faith Communities Together for a Sustainable Future. Wonderful group. Let's see here. Wisconsin. Sorry, just reading through this. Okay, I think that's more just information talking a little bit about frac sand mining. Go ahead.
Dwayne Nichols has their hand raised.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Dwayne. I meant to get to you. Dwayne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I live in Morgantown. You may be aware of the work of Professor Mike McCauley looking at the problem of diesel trucks on all these well pads. And you know, this diesel exhaust with the particulates involved, those particulates are known to enter the lungs and the bloodstream and affect both the heart and the brain. So when we talk about mental health, we also can implicate the diesel trucks. We can also implicate the fracking operation itself, where it's using this frac sand from Wisconsin, because that is silicon dioxide, otherwise known as silica, otherwise creating what we call white lung. See, here in West Virginia, we've had decades, if not centuries, of black lung problems. We still have those. But in the fracking industry, we would have gray lung from diesels and white lung from silica. And anybody that suffers from impaired lung function is also going to be almost certainly depressed and almost certainly be categorized as having a mental, if not disability challenge. So that's all part of this area we're talking about here. Darn it anyway, it's much more pervasive than we realize when we first start looking at it. I've been doing a blog for 10 years called Frack Check, and I've accumulated an incredible number of studies of the environmental impacts of this industry. I'm aware that on the well sites, there's not only leakage of methane, but there's off gas, excess gas, and off speculation gas, off spec gas. And in many cases, the mine operator has installed a combustor. I've seen a lot of these combustors right on the well site. So not only do you have flares sometimes, but you these days maybe more often have a box combustor unit that consumes these, and there's always then the effluents. And because they're operated inefficiently and irregularly, and not monitored or controlled, we have more, again, more extensive issues involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Yep, that's all. Those are all important considerations.
Let's see, does anyone have any more very specific questions for Christina before she has to jump off at 3? We can continue this conversation. I have a couple other answers I want to put out there, but I just want to make sure people get Christina while she's still here.
And then Rayna, someone asked in the chat for a link to the EPA comment submission page for the methane rules.
Yes, and I'm hoping Ryan can drop that into the chat. I think he's going to. Got it?
The link to the EPA page or the link to our summary of it?
I think the summary would be great. So I should just say that on behalf of Halt the Harm, I'm really trying to lead the work in gathering comments. And so we are just in the last sort of 11th hour of trying to get some of these sites online. So we actually have created an action page for people to submit comments. And then there's also a cutmethane.org page, which people can go to. That's being hosted by Earthworks. So either one of those is a great place to go. And again, if Ryan drops this chat or this link in the chat, those are places where you can go, and it will actually create a form for you to submit comments. So that is going to be there.
Here's the link to the Action Network landing page.
Okay, and I know, Dwayne, there's a couple of questions that people are hoping to get more information on working with you. So just wanted to point that out. And let's see,
Thank
a
you.
lung test to determine your exposure level to pollution. Christina, do you have time to say anything to that?
Long test.
I think, did you mean to say lung or long?
Regardless.
Okay.
So we, in the study I did for the fractured series, I tried to measure people's exposure who live near fracking wells by doing air monitoring, water sampling, and testing their urine samples for the presence of metabolites or breakdown products that result when our bodies are exposed to certain pollutants that are associated with fracking. So those tests are possible to do. As I mentioned with benzene, most of the chemicals of concern that are emitted from fracking wells are processed through the body really quickly. So we tested multiple times over the period of a couple of months to try and get a sense of people's overall exposure. But it's very difficult. It'd be very difficult to do like a one-time test and say, I am getting exposure or I'm not getting exposure based on the results of a one-time test, because you could have, done the test on a day when emissions were really bad, or you could have done the test on a day when there were no emissions, whereas other days are really bad. So it's a little bit tricky. There is a test that doctors can order that looks for metabolites for VOCs in your urine sample. So if it's something you're concerned about and you live near fracking wells, it's potentially something you could ask your doctor if they can order lab work to do either a blood sample or urine sample and see if you're being exposed to VOCs. But again, it's tough to know with just one test because emissions are so sporadic.
I do want to jump in and just say a huge thank you to Christina. I know you have to jump at 3. However, I see a couple hands raised, and Douglas, you can jump in and introduce yourself, but Douglas is going to stay from the Environmental Health Network, and we can continue to answer questions. So Christina, if you need to jump again, huge thank you. Amazing work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rayna. It was really great being here. And thank you again, everybody, for coming and being so engaged. Bye.
All right. So Anna, you had a question? Anna, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Talking about the other stuff of the burn off stuff, we have in our wetlands, we have an oil company operating, and the immediate community has formed a group, and they can't get anywhere, but they're constantly exposed to releases, but from a tank where it's not fracking, but they combine all the gases, all the water and the oil that comes up from the old regular wells, and then they cut off the oil. Then the water sits in the tank and it's polluted, and it releases. They have to release it, and everybody's getting sick. And the company keeps getting fined, but they don't have to pay the fines until the end. So it's a pretty messed up. But our local air quality management was insisting that they put something on top of it. They're not really insisting. They're saying this is the solution. The solution is to put this box on top that will burn off the fumes. So I guess my question is, when he talked about like other kinds of burn off, is that something? It didn't seem like a solution, because then they said, oh, then there won't be any toxic releases. Once we install this box that burns off the fumes, there won't be any releases. But do you know anything about that kind of operation at all?
I know a little bit. I don't know. Douglas, were you waving to answer that question, or just saying hi?
I was just saying hi.
Ah.
But
Darn.
I am, you know, that Anna, that raises all sorts of red flags for me. You know, I mean, maybe after you burn it, there's no more toxic releases, but the burning is going to definitely produce some problems.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting with the EPA thing that, and at that level, at that federal level, it's kind of like NOAA, you know, comes in and then you go up and you give all this input, but the people you actually have to deal with get more and more local. So our local AQMD, it's insane. This is basically not just an oil field, but to a certain extent, there's some refining going on, or at least there should be, so what they have to do is X amount of people have to call within so many on one incident for somebody to drive out from 30 miles away. And if they smell something, then they'll consider it a report. And this isn't just somebody accidentally releasing. This is ongoing. So if the wind changes because it's by the coast, then she doesn't take the report. And they've been at this for several years. And all they've managed to do is get them the formal complaints and some fines, which they don't have to pay yet. It's not really working.
Yeah, and Anna, sorry, I
won't take up any more time. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say this is a story I've heard countless times over the last 10 to 15 years I've been working on this issue. And I do hold out hope that I think the EPA is going to be moving in the right direction, where they're really saying, we understand that community monitoring is and can happen, and we can understand that we can be more responsive to it. And I think that that's just imperative. I think that some of the work I've heard in California, I mean, you know, we don't need to play this game of race to the bottom, but it's tempting sometimes to say, well, we've got it really bad here in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah.
Not the competition.
It's just been bad everywhere. And I think that the state regulatory agencies so often, you know, even if there's a strong, solid methane rule, as somebody had mentioned in Colorado, you know, you're still seeing flaring, right? And even if the state is saying, hey, we're not going to allow flaring anymore, it's still happening at the local level. And I think that it's just, again, imperative that the EPA is listening to the communities and responding to the communities in a timely fashion.
And if I could add, just first of all, by way of introduction, I'm Douglas Fischer. I run Environmental Health Sciences, which publishes environmental health news. So, and worked closely, obviously, with Christina on that whole series. And Carla, I see you have a hand up, but you know, just to speak maybe to that point, Anna and Rayna, I think this is it's speaking to the helplessness, the frustration, the stress that we're seeing in our reporting, and I think that has been undervalued. That cost has been undervalued when we look at impacts, right? That ongoing stress and frustration and feeling of hopelessness that you have no control over your neighborhood or the air you're breathing. I also, to tie it back, and I forget who said it, but there's, you know, this need for community watchdogs. You know, especially we're in a really perilous, and it's just not, I don't see it getting any better, perilous time for local journalism. Newsrooms are just being cut. You're losing, you know, experienced reporters. You're losing specialized reporters. Reporters are now covering everything from the school board to the city commission to the local health, you know, issues in the environment. And so I think that, and nothing really changes without public pressure. And it's really incumbent on you know, all of the groups represented here in this call to get the community informed and to be out there as watchdogs, to be out there informing people, to be filling a Facebook feed or whatnot, you know, to get the news out. And I see this as an especially acute need and an important role that watchdogs fill.
All right, Carla, I want to make sure we get to your question. And I saw Rob, and I think you had your hand up. I don't know if you have a question still, but let's take your question, Carla.
Okay, it's not a question. It's an answer to the lung test question.
Great.
Doctors can order pulmonary function tests, which is when you blow out into a special machine, and it can determine if you have various types of lung disorders. Now, it's non-specific for any kind of pollutants, obviously. It would just determine that you have a lung problem, but that may be helpful for some folks.
Great, thank you so much.
I would also recommend, I just want to add to that comment. This is Jenny from West Virginia with Fact Ohio. So I'm straddling 2 states here. But I would also add to get a baseline PFT before you encounter breathing problems. So if you've got fracking moving into your area, or it's been there and you've recently moved into the area, get a PFT as part of a regular physical exam, request it, and get a baseline. And that way you can monitor any changes.
And Jenny, can you just let us know what PFT stands for, just so everyone knows
Oh,
what
I'm
to
sorry,
ask for?
pulmonary function test.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make
It's
sure
where you
everyone was
blow-
aware of that.
Yeah, it's where you blow into the tube, and that measures the capacity of your lungs to exchange gases and expand and contract, etc.
Yes, thank you. Did anyone have any other questions? I'm sorry if I missed anything in the chat. I don't think I did. Kathy. I'm sorry, Kathy, did you have a question?
Oh, more of a comment. I testified at the EPA hearing on Monday night, and really, it felt like we were making really worthwhile statements for the EPA, and I would encourage anyone could do the written one or the verbal one. It sounds like we have a chance to make a difference. So thank you.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I know, Robin, now you've raised your hand again. Great.
Sorry, the first time I was doing the clap emoji, somebody said something really like spot on and profound. I really wanted to thank Christina and everyone too for also talking about a pertinent phrase of trauma and collective trauma. Before I was a community organizer with Food and Water Watch, I was a mental health counselor in private practice, specifically in eco-psychology and ecotherapy. And a lot of the clients came for different things. And as we did more assessments, shout out to Susan Clayton, who does really great environmental health assessments. She's on the report that's been in the chat. But it was really great to have like a trauma-informed focus. And also with support groups that we ran. I actually ran a couple of support groups with with Jessa at Environmental Health Project, because she's a wonderful human being. So those were some of the things, really like kind of focusing on the trauma, but the resilience from the trauma, that I really am glad we're touching upon that and coming back to that. And there was another thing too, but I'm sorry, because I don't like to speak in public. I have a lot of links too, but Christina does amazing work. And I thank you, Rayna, for all the work you did. You were the reason why I wanted to collaborate with EHP. So
thank you
for continuing the work.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you've done, Robin. Douglas?
Oh, just Robin, I'll make sure I take that message back to Christina.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. And huge shout out to Jessa. Hey, Jessa. And Patricia, do you have a question?
No, it's more like a comment. Something I've become very concerned about as I've investigated, listened to umpteen zillion reports about the results of fracking and its effects on children, is that maybe the EPA will listen, maybe FERC will listen. But I think the philosophy of the corporations is, we kill kids, we make money. Who cares? I think we need to let them know that we know about that philosophy and see what we can do about it.
Yeah, Patricia, I think we agree. I think the way to counter that philosophy is by building that public pressure to say this is just unacceptable and needs to change. And that's why I'm excited to have so many people engaged with this methane rule. It's one way, it's a multi-pronged approach, and connecting all these things together is what's going to make that voice and that message much stronger.
Will the corporations listen, or is the only way they're going to listen is if we get after them legally?
I think it's a combination. I think, right, it's not so much the corporations, it's the rule makers, it's the policymakers, it's the general public outrage. Corporations will listen when the public is outraged. And that's just, that's the hard thing just to make sure, and the economics, I think, are just so strong in many respects. And so those are big humps to get over.
Could you explain what you mean by the economics? Because I get that thrown in my face constantly when I'm trying to argue a point about, the costs of fracking. But are you referring to the financial or the moneyed?
Yeah, I think it's the financials. It's on all different levels. From the jobs that it creates and those salaries that they pay out, to the tax revenues that communities are used to just just the sheer corporate profits and what companies are able to do in terms of access to lawmakers and lobbying and advertising and that kind of stuff. So I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here because I'm in Bozeman, Montana, but I know that we're dealing with like a coal mine, right? So it's very different, but it's somewhat similar, right? Where in Montana there's a coal mine that's producing huge amounts. It's producing $100,000 jobs in this little town. It's buying this tiny town in eastern Montana, has a high school swimming pool, state-of-the-art track, all paid for by coal company revenues. And it's very hard to get a community that says, hey, I really like my track. I really like my husband has a new, a job with, we just bought this new $60,000 pickup truck. We have a camper, and you want me to say no to this? Those are the economic headwinds I would suggest that we're sailing against.
I think that picture is very similar to what we see in Appalachia too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we struggle economically, and when these high rollers come in with flashing their green bucks, it looks good, and they get their way.
Yeah, that was one of the, so the fractured story actually explored that Christina did, where this, one of the families she profiled was like, I'm all in, and I love, a $15,000 check, sure, and then he kind of like, oh my gosh, that was the most expensive check I've ever cashed, kind of thing, because it was like easy money up front, and then all this stress and problems up, on the back end, and that's the story that's not being told in some ways.
Thank you.
Well, and I guess, from my years of working on health issues and fracking, I have a very simple perspective, which is we're selling our health. We're selling out ourselves, we're selling out our communities, and the price we pay is our health. And I think that we have to make that just absolutely 100% unacceptable. And I think one of the things that, and this is really starting to shift, and I want to really emphasize that what we're seeing out of the EPA right now is a major change, right? So this is not something we could have ever imagined in the past 5 years or 4 years. So the industry is on notice that they have to clean up their act. They will continue to say that they're doing everything right. I've heard an industry spokesperson say that in the last 2 weeks, and that they're not harming the local community. And I think that the more we can just say, well, you're not only harming the local community, but you're harming us at the global level. We have to stop this. We have to protect ourselves. We cannot sell out our health. As you said, Douglas, a $15,000 check, you know, if you're selling out your health long term, that is not something that's going to provide for your financial stability. And yeah, that's a tough choice for a lot of people, because I think that in the short term, certain people do benefit. And so it's just very hard to turn their backs on that and say, it's not worth it in the end. I just want to make sure if anybody else has any questions. I see a couple of hands still raised, and I think I called on you, but just jump in if you have any final questions.
I just wanted to say, out here in California, when it comes to like, can you make any change? We're in the middle of a process that started with 3 different low-income, heavily impacted communities in the LA County area, and existing wells, and just being, you know, generations of illness and sickness. One was a teenager that started it, but anyway, they formed a coalition called STAND, STANDLA, and along with others had been pressuring for a setback. And we had it introduced in the state legislature. It didn't go forward, but now we've got our state regulatory agency, CalGEM, advocating for this setback, this 3,500-foot setback, which is not enough. And they were holding hearings even on it yesterday. But of course, also showing up at the hearings are the oil and gas workers. And it's so insane that I just noticed that as an activist when the nuclear industry, they started bringing workers in buses and off our coast with a liquefied natural gas. So this is a strategy to round up your workers, get your workers to show up with their kids on a Saturday and say that they absolutely have to keep a chemical in the refinery that is so dangerous that if it gets out, it will kill people instantly in order to keep their jobs. So this is like, I think it's pretty desperate on their part. And it's not pretty transparent what's happening, but it works sometimes. But you know, it's not genuine. These workers don't genuinely, they're afraid for their jobs. And even in Wilmington, apparently, I've heard when environmentalists try to go door to door, people won't talk to them because they don't want to be seen talking to an environmentalist because the community is so dependent. So you know, that's just, I think, but I do think this is working. I think we're going to get this setback, you know, and that will be something. Of course, it's not for the existing wells, just for the new ones. So what are you going to do? Thank you.
This is Dwayne. I have a question. I've heard of a concept called environmentally sourced gas, and I think it's a front for companies to pretend like they're being environmentally conscious and are planning to go to what they call zero by 2050. Has anybody encountered any good arguments against, or articles, studies that we can use to point out the absurdity of environmentally sourced gas? Thank you.
Dwayne, I just made a note of that because that's something that is mostly new to me, although it's ringing bells of possible memory in some way. So I want to look into that. And that's again where I'm going to put another plug. I think any and all of these forums are great. And that's absolutely what Halt the Harm Network, of course, is doing with this event here, which is to just try and bring people together and try and have this peer-to-peer conversation so that people can start to answer each other's questions. So I really do strongly encourage people, you know, join in discussions, use the Halt the Harm Network to the best of your ability, and please send us questions. Let us know if there's something, you know, that, like you just said, Dwayne, you think we can answer. In the meantime, I will look into that and see if I can post some answers on our site. All right, did I miss anything? I see a lot of chatter in the chat, but I don't think there's any other questions there.
I have,
Patricia, I'm sorry, Patricia.
Is the gas that I get from under the landfills environmentally sourced gas, or is environmentally sourced gas just fossil fuels?
Does anyone know the answer to that question? Because that's something I want to look into.
No, let's look up the definition.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that companies like EQT, maybe Consol, others have over the years professed an adherence to environmental preparedness and efficiency and meeting all of the regulations. But at the same time, we don't have such a thing as clean coal. We don't have such a thing as green gas or green hydrogen, for that matter, because these are all problems that have environmental impacts. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of corporate greenwashing, certainly that's happening. And I think what you just said, Dwayne, points out the fact that if they say they're meeting all the regulations, but the regulatory system is as weak as it is, it's not good enough. So that's where, again, we really need to strengthen our regulations and make this a less fossil fuel friendly world.
I have a
All right.
question.
Sure.
One more.
Yep.
And it has to do with the trauma issue, and that is dealing with the paradigm of sacrifice, especially in the regions of Appalachia that I'm in West Virginia and Ohio, as well as Pennsylvania. There is a paradigm of sacrifice that's what we do in West Virginia. We sacrifice. We give it up, and so we can get something else. But we give up more than we maybe should or can or have been asked to, even sometimes. But does anybody have any suggestions or any models that they've used to deal with that? It's tough to deal with people on the ground in the frack fields who believe that this is their contribution to their families or their communities, going this way of giving up their land and giving up their health. And yes, they get a paycheck, and yes, they can pay the mortgage and put a new roof on, but it's within the framework of sacrifice. They're doing it for that reason. I struggle with it.
Yeah, and I have raised this point many times over the course of the work I've done on fracking and health, and being here in southwestern Pennsylvania and working in this tri-state region too, which is, there's a lot of pride, honestly, involved in being here, in being part of essentially an energy sacrifice economic model, and to say, hey, I'm really supporting the Industrial Revolution, I'm supporting steel, I'm supporting local manufacturing, and people are proud of these jobs, and they have been, and they were proud of the coal industry, they were proud of the steel industry. There is a tremendous amount of not just sacrifice, but I think pride, which is wrapped up in this really Rust Belt history. And I sincerely hope that people are going to turn their attention. And I think that's where you see some of the youth, and Malcolm, I think, is a great example of that, who are now looking around and saying, that's not the direction we really want to look ahead and move into, right? So it's happening, but it's happening certainly way more in, I think, some of the urban communities than it is in parts of West Virginia and some of the more rural communities. And this is across Pennsylvania and Ohio, of course, and across Appalachia, really. Yeah, and that's a narrative. I mean, it's a dominant narrative. It's actually seen, I think, more as a positive narrative, you know, that people have given up their health. They've accepted black lung, they've accepted COPD, and that's how they, you know, supported their families. And, you know, how much as a society do we say that's okay, that people sacrifice themselves in that way? And you have the right to be proud of selling out your health, you know, to support your family. Yeah, so I think that's a theme that runs under everything I see happening in our
Well, it's
region.
kind of a, yeah, it's kind of a tension between the pride component and the sacrifice. There's a lot of tension there, I think. And I think that the industry is able to find the cracks in that and maximize their profits from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are. Well, we're coming up on 3:30. I don't want to keep everyone too long. And I do want to point out that Anna put an answer in the chat for responsibly sourced gas. So I just
Maybe
wanted to
that's
point
it.
that out for people.
I don't know if that's it.
Yeah, so that's something to look into. Douglas, do you have anything else that you want to say to wrap this up?
Just express some gratitude to everybody for the work everyone is out there doing. It was just an honor to listen and to be in here. And I think I've got actually a couple of good story ideas coming out of this session. So thank you guys.
Excellent. Well, EHN does the most amazing reporting, so huge applause there. And again, thanks to all of you. And, you know, let's just say one last time that taking action really helps improve our mental health. So let's keep at it. Keep taking action.
Just
right,
one
thank
more.
you. Yeah,
one more
Patricia.
comment.
Sure.
Yes, I'm sorry to interject something more, but when you're talking about environmentally sourced gas, could it mean ethanol? Ethanol is made from corn, and we have a lot of ethanol producing places here in Wisconsin. I'm not sure that might be the case, but it's something worth pursuing.
Yeah, nothing came up.
Yeah, that's something. I think that this is definitely a flag for us to do a little bit more digging and see what we can find. So thank you. That's a possibility.
Will the chat notes be available?
Yes, Ryan did confirm that. So, you know, if you're all registered, so we will be sending out something that will show this recording, and we'll also have the notes. So again, thank you to everyone. I'm really happy that we had this really engaged discussion, and look forward to continuing it online. So thank you so much.